Welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, airing live Monday nights on KGRAradio.com and now as a podcast on iTunes and wherever else you can find it. You can learn more at my member site, richarddolanmembers.com. Now, join me for a fascinating exploration of all the things you secretly want to talk about, from UFOs to government shenanigans, strange science, future tech, and more. Here on KGRA Radio, welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. Greetings, it's August 27th, 2018. Happy to be here with you tonight. It's been a busy week for me, finishing up some touches on a booklet I'm writing. More on that over the next few weeks. I did an interview last week on Jimmy Church's Fade to Black radio show where we had an extremely wide-ranging discussion, I would say. We ended up having a rather candid conversation about Gaia. Check the last 30 minutes of his program for that. Did a couple of impromptu live streams as well, which are now on my YouTube channel. One on the simulation hypothesis, which I enjoy thinking about from time to time, and then one on the proliferation of fakers in the field of ufology. There's too many of them, and seems to be getting worse. I'm not saying everyone lies, but I am saying some people lie because, well, some people have always lied. And other people seem to crave the lies. Weird. There's a kind of sickness growing in our society overall, at least in my view. We see it reflected in the UFO community, but it's really in many places. It's not unique to UFO areas. I'm quite persuaded at this point that our corporate media establishment breeds a kind of mental instability in the population. And I mean literally mental instability. It's a kind of disassociation. I'm going to return to this at another time, but it's just a thought for the moment I'd like you to ponder. We have a media establishment that is not your friend. I read, because I have to, I feel, mainstream and alternative news stories pretty much every day. In my opinion, the U.S. mainstream media is the worst. U.S. and U.K., actually, about tied for the worst. In terms of the range of what they cover and how they cover it, it's by far the most limited, I would say, childish and propagandistic of any of the national news medias that I can see. There's a reason for that, and I've discussed it many times in the past, and I will come back to that again soon, promise. But tonight I have a fascinating guest for you. During the last few months, I've been seeking out UFO researchers from around the world. This one is from Germany. My friend, the journalist Robert Fleischer. Robert and I have known each other for about 10 years or so, and he's not only a dedicated student of UFOs, but he's one of the leaders in Germany and Central Europe in getting the word out, as well as in dealing with the German government. He's had a great deal of experience in both of these areas, as well as having a strong knowledge of some of the most interesting cases in Europe over the past few decades. Before I bring Robert on, I'll just remind you that if you want to follow what I'm doing, you can go to my website, richarddolanmembers.com, where I delve into UFOs, geopolitics, and false flags in the form of video, audio, and blog posts. Also see my traditional site of richarddolanpress.com, where I have books written by myself and many other fascinating authors, most recently an excellent study by Dr. Bruce Maccabee on the seminal year of 1952 and why it matters to this day. Definitely find me on my YouTube channel, which is extremely active for me these days, and that includes my live stream show, Intelligent Disclosure. Of course, you can always find me here on KGRA every week doing this program. So without any further waiting, let me bring on my guest, a very interesting pre-recorded discussion with Robert Fleischer. Robert, welcome to the Richard Dolan Show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
It's a great pleasure for me to be back. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, we have known each other for more than a decade, I believe.
Yeah, that's true.
I recall meeting you at, I think, if I'm not mistaken, some of the X conferences organized by Steve Bassett back in,
2008 or something?
Yeah,
2009?
It might have been 2008.
It
might have been earlier, unless that was your first time there. But you've been very active in European ufology, and I know you're not just a ufologist or an investigator of the paranormal. You are a journalist, but you've done a great deal of work in really opening up the UFO phenomenon in Central Europe. And I don't know if there's many people out there doing what you do, but perhaps we can get a chance to talk about the status of German UFO research. But
Sure.
for people who aren't familiar at all with UFOs and Germany, what do they need to know?
Well, they first need to know that, like UFOs, that's a complete taboo in Germany. And, we had this, I grew up in East Germany, so that's the communist zone occupied by the Soviets, tanks rolling in the streets and stuff. No, it was not as bad as that. And we had this joke about East Germany. It's why are bananas curved? Because for 40 years they had to make a turn around East Germany. I hope I translated that correctly.
Sounds pretty good.
And because we couldn't buy any bananas in East Germany, and if they were on sale somewhere, then it quickly became known, and people lined up in front of the stores, and like you had a line of 10 meters, 20 meters or so.
Wow.
And then you came in and you were able to buy 1 kilogram of bananas that are almost rotten in a way,
Yeah.
But still you bought those bananas, and then you changed your clothes and stepped into the line again to get some more, Anyway, so that's the situation about UFOs in Germany. I haven't seen any curved UFOs, but they seem to make a turn around Germany because this is a non-existent subject for the German government.
It seems that way. I mean, there's very
Absolutely.
little, if any, information that ever comes out of Germany relating to the subject of UFOs, unlike, say, France or Britain, or
Exactly.
even Russia, which actually has over time had a great deal of UFO information come out. But Germany, a close ally of the United States, nothing.
And also a close ally and a direct neighboring country to France, which has been researching UFOs for more than 40 years.
Yes,
And
I mean, it's an odd
it's
thing.
really interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
And I started doing this full time in June 2007 or so, when I founded Exopolitics Germany, and since then I've been working on this subject. And then I founded the Exo magazine, online TV magazine for subscribers, which helps me to do this, to follow this full time. And this is really what it needs to get something going here. And I got something going, and I think I can give you a little overview of what I've been doing and how this all. Well, in fact, if you want to understand the German situation, it all goes back to the United Nations decision 33426 from 1978. I'm sure you're very well aware of that. That's the decision upon the initiative of Grenada, where the General Assembly decided they would invite interested member states to conduct research on UFOs and extraterrestrial life, and to inform the Secretary General about their findings and conclusions. And in fact, the original aim, as you surely know, was not just this mere invitation to interested member states, but in fact the Prime Minister of Grenada, Sir Eric Gary, had wanted to establish a UFO study group at a United Nations level, at the Outer Space Committee. And I made some research at the political archives of the German Foreign Office. And I found documents that show that this aim was actually hindered by Germany's permanent mission to the United Nations, among others, by the way.
Oh, yes. Well, by the U.S. and Britain also were very opposed to Eric Gary's initiative, but the Germans
Austria,
as well.
Yeah, Austria as well.
Yeah.
And I found, for example, a telegram from November 28, 1978, where it already talks about this upcoming decision. And it says Grenada has presented this resolution draft on UFOs at the Space Committee, which proposes the establishment of an expert group which is supposed to define the framework for UN studies about the UFO phenomenon under the supervision of the Outer Space Committee. And then they go, quite apart from the wider implications of such resolution draft, the reference to the Outer Space Committee alone has its misgivings, as it would incur Grenada's desire to become a member of the Outer Space Committee, which would therefore be constantly occupied with the UFO question. And then they say,
God forbid.
This item, and then they say, this item will probably be finished reading until the end of the week, and until then, the USA and Austria will try to persuade Grenada to withdraw its resolution draft and to accept a more general declaration which invites interested member states to become a member of a non-UN committee for the study of UFOs. So that's an interesting point. You see, even back in 1978, the Germans were already, pretty firm on not allowing this subject on an international level to be discussed officially.
Yes, yes.
And the thing is, I've always been wondering, why is it, because back then in the Cold War, I mean, Germany was not really like the most outstanding, most decisive, capable superpower in the world to play on the foreign policy.
Right. What were the Germans doing in international major international relations at that time?
Exactly.
One might wonder. Yeah.
Exactly, and even back then, it was closely allied to the United States, of course, and the United States were kind of deciding the direction where this was all going to go. I mean, there were those bloc states, as you surely know, the Warsaw Pact states and the NATO states, and then there was some third party, how do you call them, at the United Nations level?
Well, they were non-aligned. They were sometimes known as non-aligned states, yes.
Yeah. So Germany already back then played along with the Americans and the Western Pact, let's call it like that.
Oh, yeah.
And it's interesting because this United Nations decision, which invited member states to conduct UFO research, may not have been legally binding, but still France, even at that time, more or less around the same time, decided to conduct UFO research. I mean, they have Minister of Defense in 1974 already saying that this would be an interesting subject to analyze and study at the level of the space Centre Spatial Recherche Scientifique.
Yes.
So the Space Research Center, the National Space Research Center and stuff. So they obviously kind of followed this advice, right? And Germany didn't. And in fact, when I started this whole thing, the last official statement that I could find from a German politician was from 2008 by the then Minister of the Interior, Wolfgang Schäuble, who's, by the way, still in office, in another office now, but in another capacity, but he's still active. And he said, in 2008, he said, a federal authority dealing with alleged sightings of unknown flying objects is not known here. That is how he said that. And if you think about it, being the Minister of the Interior, he should know whether there is something or not,
think about it. Germany, particularly during the Cold War. So, for listeners who may not remember those days, you and I do. By the way, I spent one summer in East Germany, the DDR, Deutsche Demokratische Republik, back in 1986, not long before it started to unravel. I went back briefly in 1987 as well, and I had friends who actually were official East German dissidents who were being persecuted by the government. That's a whole other story. Maybe we can talk about that sometime. But I had my own little mini adventures. Yes. My German has become sehr schlecht, very bad in the intervening years, unfortunately. Yeah. Very bad. But I would just say, if you think back to that period of time, so you've got the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact nations, as you mentioned the Soviet allies, Eastern Europe, basically. And then you had Western Europe. Germany, which was divided, it was split between East and West, was the center of the Cold War, obviously.
Exactly.
And then you would think, and in fact it's true, that sightings of unknown objects over Germany would be very important. And in fact, we have a number of anecdotal reports. The astronaut, a U.S. astronaut, Gordon Cooper, talked about overflight of UFOs in Germany back in the 1950s. And there are these other reports that have come again and again relating to very, very dramatic UFO sightings over Germany. So clearly this is important. And yet here we have a German Minister of the Interior in 2008 saying, nope, there are no federal agencies investigating unknown aircraft. Like, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me?
Yeah, you see, that's exactly that was my strategy when I started working on this subject, because how do you want to convince people that there is something to the subject of UFOs if there's so few people who have ever seen one and no one is saying anything officially? So I compiled a whole list of 20 countries worldwide, more than 20 countries now actually, that have released military files on what they've known and found out about UFOs. You know, I mean, most prominently, of course, the British. They have released tons of files, but also the French, also the Spanish were the first actually to
back in the
publish
70s.
their files. Yeah. So having all those this list of 20 countries around the world, in your hand, it's really difficult to deny for German authorities to say that this is a subject of interest to many.
Yeah, it's like all around,
but
not the Germans, not the Germans.
So in 2009, I started another approach, and in 2009, in fact. I had the chance to have a member of the German Bundestag, so that's the federal parliament, the highest German parliament, to have her asked by a friend of mine about UFOs, because he said, now I'm doing this interview, what could I ask her? And I said, ask her about this UN decision 33426, why this has never been implemented in Germany. And so he did, and he went there in November 2009. He went there and he asked her that question, and she was completely speechless. She didn't know what to say. She said, well, I have no idea. I mean, she took it seriously, but she was very, very brave. She took it seriously, and she actually she asked the scientific research service of the German Bundestag to draft a report on why that UN decision has never been implemented, and another one about the
and again, just to remind people, this decision is to initiate a government agency that would, I believe, receive and perhaps report about UFO sightings.
Right.
This is what Gary wanted.
This decision invited member states to conduct UFO research on a national level,
and she's
the United Nations.
She's starting an inquiry as to why they hadn't done it. That's amazing.
Exactly, and she did that, and sure enough, just a couple of weeks later, I had a big envelope in my mailbox, and I opened it, and it was a very nice letter she wrote, and it was forwarded to me, and it was an interesting study. I mean, besides of the complete lack of facts, that's, I have to say, though, they quoted from Exopolitics websites, for example. They didn't even have the original text of that UN decision. They took it from a website from Exopolitics.
Wow.
That's really interesting. And they also had just complete meaningless information on what they don't know, and they had a list of TV shows dealing with UFOs. It's really, really weird. But the part where it goes about the United Nations decision, they said, well, we didn't do it because we were not legally obliged to do so. It is just an invitation. Right. We had the right not to do it, and also
that was true.
And also they said, and that was very interesting, they said the fact that both Great Britain and France had been dealing with questions about the existence of UFOs and extraterrestrial life forms and have given up their secrecy to publish it even on the internet suggests the assumption that German authorities or ministries have been dealing with that question as well. So that was like the first time I had it black on paper in writing, that was complete opposite of the official German statement on UFOs, right? That we're not interested in stuff. And here they go and say, well, probably they do have an interest. And of course, it didn't prove anything. But
where did that letter come from, Robert? Was that from the German
That was the Scientific Research Service. That was the authors were two scientists from the Scientific Research Service who said that.
So they were essentially speculating, but it's a reasonable speculation that if the
it
Brits
was
and the
reasonable,
Germans
and they went on to state that especially at the times of the Cold War, where where that's exactly what you just said before, where you had to watch out for possible enemy drones or spy planes and stuff of the political enemy. It is highly likely that German authorities have been dealing with questions of unidentified flying objects, especially in Germany, which was the epicenter of the Cold War. So
Exactly.
So that was really interesting. I made that public in 2010, and then what followed was a whole episode, a whole series of legal proceedings to get this report into the public. Because even though I was able to quote from it, I was not able to publish it.
Oh, really?
I didn't know, of course. I didn't try to publish it in its entirety. But there was a citizen from Berlin, Frank Reitemeyer, who's my hero, and you will soon see why he's my hero. He wanted to see that study as well. He filed an FOIA request according to the German Freedom of Information Act, and he was denied access because the Freedom of Information Act in Germany is only from 2006, and they said it would not be applicable to studies written by the Scientific Research Service of the German Bundestag because everything that's related to parliamentary actions and work would not be included in that act.
So they are impervious to FOIA requests, the German Parliament.
Exactly, and not just the parliament, not only the parliament, but specifically all the studies undertaken by the Scientific Research Service of the Bundestag. And
That's amazing. That would be like in America to say that U.S. Congress is immune from the Freedom of Information Act. That's what this sounds like. That's incredible.
But that's the fact here in Germany. It's still the fact. The thing is, this scientific service of the Bundestag is there to inform deputies of the parliament in their daily work. If they have a question, a specific question on, let's say, wars against international law undertaken by
by the United States.
Oh, I didn't want to say that. They can go there and ask specific questions and have them write these kinds of studies, and this is like the foundation for their work they are doing for them in their capacity as the parliamentarians, as those who take decisions in our names. So it should be open to the public what's written in those studies, right? It should be public. So he was denied access. He sued the German government, and in December 2011, the first instance administrative court in Berlin approved his request and ordered the Bundestag to release that study. But of course, the Bundestag lodged an appeal. Oh. And in November 2013, the next instance court, the higher administrative court of Berlin-Brandenburg, revoked that decision and said, no, it's a parliamentary thing, doesn't, Freedom of Information Act doesn't apply here. Go figure, And Frank Reitemeyer, he really struggled to lodge an appeal for lack of funding, because he was just this one
Robert,
guy.
May I just want to make sure. So this report that he's trying to get out, this is the report that had already been sent to you from your direct request. So you had already been able to read the report, and from what it sounded like to me, it's not even a smoking gun. It's simply
not even exactly.
It's simply a reply to your request, and a speculation that the German military and government might have dealt with the UFO phenomenon as the British and the French. I mean, that's really all that was said in there, right? Is that correct?
That's correct.
And they are not letting that out to the public. It's that little tepid statement the German government is fighting tooth and nail to prevent from coming out. That's amazing.
Yeah, and just to give you an idea about the German mindset when it comes to freedom of information versus government secrecy, because up until 2006, we had the principle of administration secrecy. That's how they called it. This is Amtsgeheimnis. Government secrecy or administrative secrecy. You don't need to know. go home. There's nothing to see here. We take our decisions based upon our own information, and you're not supposed to know what we know. That's what it was like until 2006. Of course, there were exceptions for journalists, even back then when I was still working for television,
Okay.
You could go to some authority and show them your press card, and say, look, I have the right under the Press Act, or I don't know how you call it in English, to give me information. But still, at that time, it really depended on whether they liked you or not, or it really depended on what you wanted to know. And they were not really, there had always been ways to deny you access to official information in
Robert,
Germany.
we have about a minute before we have to have a break, and
Yes.
we can come back to this after the break. But how did this resolve? Can you say that quickly?
Yes, in June 2015, the highest administrative court in Germany finally decided that the studies are to be released under the German Freedom of Information Act. And this was a real milestone, because now all the information from those kinds of studies are available to the German public, and not only in terms of UFOs, but all other kinds of interesting and important stuff.
Oh, so this will actually open up a range of potential UFO reports, is what this sounds like. Is that correct?
Not exactly UFO reports, because the scientific service doesn't deal with UFOs normally.
Sorry, I just made a mistake. I'll have to edit that out. I just dropped something. Okay, so not that, but perhaps there may be a window opening in some manner legally.
Remember the airstrikes recently from the US, UK, and France on Syria, where German Chancellor, she said, well, the United Nations Security Council was obviously too occupied in this question and could not cooperate in this question, and therefore it was important for those countries to take responsibility, to bear that responsibility to attack Syria. Mm. And in fact, the scientific service of the Bundestag said clearly in one of those studies, no, this is against international law. This is just illegal, And this is all, we only know this now because of the brave action of Frank Reitermeier, who sued the German government.
Fascinating. And it's something that you have your part to play in. That's really
yes,
quite
actually, I assisted him in crowdfunding and helping him to find funds for his appeal.
And your your initial inquiry into the UFO situation also sparked it.
So in a way, I helped to write legal history in Germany.
Yeah. Well done, sir. Listen, we're going to take a very quick break, Robert. And so we're on, this is Richard Dolan. I'm here with Robert Fleischer, German journalist, with a great deal of background in the UFO subject. And we're going to return to discuss some UFO cases, as well as some other government actions, I believe. So stick around. We'll be right back after this. We're back. I'm Richard Dolan here with Robert Fleischer of Germany. And Robert, so just to make sure we've got the that last segment kind of nailed down, you were seeking to obtain information that was it was a letter that had arrived to you saying that Germany may have also had its own UFO reports, and it was impossible to get that published. So what's the status of what can German citizens know now? What could be published on the web in Germany as a result of this?
Well, it's interesting. The original assumption from the authors of the study undertaken by the scientific service of the Bundestag had been that German authorities may have very well had an interest in the UFO subject, just like France and Great Britain. Yes. And it was only a couple of years, I think 2 years after the last court decision about the release of that study, that it became known that the German Foreign Intelligence Agency, BND, Bundesnachrichtendienst, had been researching UFO sightings at the inner German border for years, actually. The inner German border, that's between East Germany and West Germany, where West Germany was, of course, controlled by the Americans, the British, the French, yes, and the French and others, and East Germany by the Soviets. And this inner German border was heavily guarded. It was a death strip that marked the front line of the Cold War.
Yes.
It separated NATO allies from those of the Warsaw Pact. And it was not only the military that kept an eye on the border, but also this foreign secret service. From 1982 to 1986, the BND collected and analyzed witness reports on unidentified flying objects along the inner German border.
Well, that's fascinating. I'm sure much more than 1982 to 86, but even so, you have records from that period are available now.
Yes, that's at least what's become known. There's a set of documents that is available at the National Archive of Germany in Koblenz. And in fact, it is still closed. It is still unavailable, and parts of it. But in fact, there's like a special regulation saying that if a researcher, like a scientist or so, a historian, applies for access to certain parts of that document, then it will be reviewed. The classification will be reviewed, and then it will also be available to other interested researchers or journalists. I'm not sure if it's available to the public.
They will decide who has access to it. It sounds like.
Yes, yeah. And in fact, I have it here in front of me, and there it says that there are certain pages of it that are still not to be released until the year 2063. So it's
wait a minute, this is from the 1980s.
Yes,
and that's an entire human lifetime. So, well, what? So you have these papers, and can you describe them? What's in them? What makes them interesting?
What makes them interesting? Well, first of all, it's not so big. It's only 67 pages. Mm-hmm. It's mainly sightings reports and analysis by the Bundesnachrichtendienst, and the majority of the files, or the majority of the cases contained in this file, are conventionally explainable. Like, it's just conventional cases, but there are also cases that remained unidentified, even for the intelligence analysts. And one of these cases occurred on the Baltic island of Fehmarn in 1986. It was early in the morning of August 26 when 3 border guards observed a bright lit object from the window of their office that slowly approached the Puttgarden ferry station and stopped in midair at an altitude of around 50 to 60 meters. And the witnesses didn't hear any flight noises, only a relatively quiet humming noise. The shape, color, and size could not be determined by the border guards because it had a radiant, dazzling illumination, as they said. And after a while, the object floated further eastwards at the same height and disappeared. And the Bundesnachrichtendienst investigated this case. They interviewed the witnesses, but their search was unsuccessful. The sighted object remained unidentified, and this is just one of those cases that they have investigated.
So this is over the Baltic Sea in late August of 1986.
Exactly.
A bright object over that that moved toward the east as it departed, but it
ferry station. Yeah,
it did not move in any kind of conventional manner, I gather.
Yeah, it had. Well, it didn't have erratic maneuvers or anything. There's nothing of this described in the report. It's just that the shape, color, and size, and it just didn't match anything conventional. And this is exactly the reason why the BND was investigating such UFO reports, because, of course, as the authors of the scientific service of the Bundestag had also pointed out, they were looking for potential enemy spy drones or enemy craft or anything unusual around the borders of West Germany, because it could be the Soviets, trying to find out something that they weren't supposed to know.
Well, right.
What's also interesting that in this BND UFO file, as we call it, it really documents how the BND systematically conducted UFO research for years, and it also contains a handwritten note which says, "Please create a UFO process," or "Please start a UFO process." And it's just a handwritten note beside one of those cases, and that really made us think. In fact, it was Andreas Müller, a friend and colleague of mine, who's also a journalist from Grenzwissenschaft Aktuell. It's like Fringe Science News or something. He had first access to that file, and he said, it's really clear that that term UFO was used across the whole document. Everyone knew what a UFO process was at that time. So, the assumption that unexplained aerial phenomena may not have been called UFO or something may just be wrong. They plainly called it UFO.
The Germans were using that phrase, even though that's an American acronym.
Yeah, well, in German, you would say unidentifiziertes fliegendes Objekt or unbekanntes fliegendes Objekt. So it also comes
It's
to
UFO.
abbreviation like this. Yeah.
Okay. Right.
So, but what's interesting, we don't know what that UFO process consists of. What is it? Is it really just the collection and analysis of those sightings reports, or are there any other things? I mean, there are lots of pages blacked out or just missing in that in that file here, so we still don't know the real extent and scope of that project that the BND was doing there.
There actually were a number of interesting German cases from around that time. I recall, and I'm sure you recall this, the German researcher, he's not doing much anymore, but Michael Hessemann,
Yes.
I know, promoted a number of, there was a UFO photograph that he promoted from around that time in the 1980s, and I'm trying to recall the exact year on it. I have it in my own files. You might remember. It's a photograph. Does this ring a bell for you? Or
No, sorry.
Oh, man, I wish I had this. Anyway, I'll find it after we're done interviewing, I'm sure. But
Yeah.
There are a number of these cases that were out there. But I'm assuming like none of those appear in the BND files that you're referring to.
No, in fact, the case that I just mentioned is like the most interesting. There are other cases like here, for example, they say possible drone, and that's in 1983, I think.
And they were talking about drones in the early 80s. That's interesting, too.
Yes, they use the word drone, and they say, now what's the exact date here? I can't see. Well, it's from the 80s in any case. And they go, a traveler reported following that between 3 o'clock and 3:15 p.m. He went by car from Berlin West to Hamburg. And he saw a fly like an aircraft or something that was that had stabilizers at its tail, and it looked very smooth, and it had a dark contrail behind it. And you see, so this doesn't
sound like conventional technology. Yeah.
Conventional. I mean, this sounds like conventional technology. It doesn't sound like a what we would call a real UFO sighting.
No, definitely.
And and then he goes that he goes on to state that after 30 seconds later he saw two modern air jets that followed that object. So it's many stuff like that is contained in the file. From travelers, from all kinds of witnesses.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I would think that there are definitely ways to go through this, and I'm sure you and other German researchers have talked about this. I want to come back to the BND files if there's anything else there. But so, for example, remember in the spring of 1990, over Belgium, there were the famous sightings that the Royal Belgian Air Force talked about. But some of those UFO sightings, I believe, were in parts over the border in Germany, northwestern Germany, if I'm not mistaken. So there were, I mean, and it does happen, and I'm just hoping one day there might be a crowbar to pry open these records. So maybe someone can petition the German government for its response to that night. That's late March of 1990. Do you know what I mean? Like there must be other examples of German government or German military response to these UFOs.
Absolutely, and if you think about it, like the way the German or the Belgian military reacted to that sightings, they even scrambled jets and stuff,
Exactly.
So for me, it's just difficult to imagine the German military wouldn't be interested in this kind of occurrences in their neighboring country, just in the bordering region to Germany. That's but so far I don't know of any German military document detailing anything of use about this, and that from that time it's really difficult.
And what about German, German newspapers, magazines, independent researchers, in addition to yourself? Are they compiling a list of cases that Germans can, have a list of such things?
Well, that's an interesting story, because back in the 1990s, I would say the UFO subject was more prominent in the media than it is now in Germany. In the 1990s, especially, I mean, the Belgian wave was, didn't pass unnoticed in the German media, and there was a big news TV network, RTL, that still exists today. It's from Luxembourg. Originally, and so that's exactly the region where this, more or less the region where this all took place. So Luxembourg, it's this corner between the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, and they send a reporter to Belgium, and he interviewed the people and also the gendarme. How do you say gendarme in English?
Police.
The police, military police or something.
Military police, sure.
The military policemen who watched that object, and he went with them in their police car, and they described to him in front of the camera how they saw this big triangular shaped object that hovered silently just 100 meters away to their left-hand side over a field, and they followed it. It was completely noiseless. It's really strange to see this TV report. It's become quite popular.
Wow.
Even now, if you look at it, because it's like news from another dimension or another world. If you compare like the seriousness and the way how they report on this police UFO sighting back then and how they do it now, it's just such a huge difference,
so that
because nowadays
that case was from sometime during the 1990s. Do you recall?
1990s, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so it was a German production that was taking this UFO subject very, very seriously, unlike today.
It was just on the news. It was just like a 3 or 4 minute TV news report.
Wow.
It was not even a special report or something. It was just on the news, at that time. And nowadays, if you read about the Belgium UFO wave, you read something like, allegedly one night something was seen by a couple of people. Maybe they drank too much and stuff,
Wow.
And they just completely ignore the facts that this lasted more than a year, the Belgian UFO wave, and it was seen by hundreds of people, and the Belgian military scrambled jets and everything. They just completely ignore those facts.
Many Belgian police officers as well. In fact, some of the earliest were very excellent witnesses to these triangular objects that were very clearly defined and would come extremely low, hover silently. Unlike anything that anyone had really ever seen.
Yeah.
For quite some time.
I'd always been suspecting that the German government actually knows more on the subject than they would actually affirm. I've made several attempts to find out more. Mm-hmm. And if you'd like, I can tell you a little bit about this.
Yes, I'd love to.
Because the question had always been, if there is a German authority, who would be responsible for UFO sightings reports? And it turns out that in December 2011, there was the head of a German UFO association that made inquiries to several ministries, both on a national and on a local level, because we have the federal government, which is like the federal government of the United States, and then we have federal states, which is like United States,
Yes.
And so in December 2011, the Ministry of the Interior of North Rhine-Westphalia, that's one of those federal states, confirmed that the police forwards reports on unexplained aerial phenomena when they are related to airspace security issues to a so-called National Situation and Command Center for Air Safety, NLFZ. That's a NATO Combined Air Operations Center in North Rhine-Westphalia, close to the Dutch border. And this was also confirmed in March 2012 by a spokesperson of the police. and by others also. And a friend of mine who has a magazine in Switzerland, he made further inquiries, and he found out that he was informed that there's a confidential agreement between the German federal government and the individual federal states of Germany, but details of that procedure are not public, are not open to the public, accessible to the public. So there is supposedly that a certain confidential agreement that details how to proceed in terms of unexplained aerial phenomena, and that they will be forwarded to that situation and command center for air safety. So that was in 2011. You know, so we'd always been thinking that in 2011, or as of 2011, it was more or less clear to us that if there's any German authority that deals with UFO sightings, it must be that famous NLFZ. And in fact, you know, I made several attempts in 2015. For example, I had the chance to ask the spokesperson of the German government about UFO files, and he said. And you know, and I think he recognized me because he used to be my boss when I worked for ZDF television, when he was still working for television as well, and now he's the spokesperson of the government. And he said, "I know there are a lot of people who spend a lot of time debating on this on the internet. It is not the center of German government policy, and not even on the fringes of this government's policy, nor do we have the feeling that it is in any way a question that would be important for good coexistence in Germany or in the world."
Whoa, stop right there.
Yeah.
The last statement. Nor do we feel it is a good thing for coexistence in the world.
It would be important for good coexistence in Germany or in the world.
In other words, by talking about this, it would start trouble? That's what it sounds like to me.
Well, it sounds like we just don't deal with it. And I also asked the speaker of the Ministry of Defense, and he said, well, please understand that I just cannot tell anything about this in this context or in this room or in this situation or something. I just don't know anything on this.
But let's just back up. But there is, in other words, a confirmation from the state of Westphalia in Germany that this organization, I think you called it the National Situation and Air Safety Center. This is a German. Center. Yeah, this is a command center. This is a German-wide office. It's not just from Westphalia, and that they do receive German UFO reports that affect national security.
That the police
submit.
That the police forwards them all reports on unexplained aerial phenomena when they are related to airspace security.
Yes, so that's important.
That's the thing.
So they receive at least those UFO reports. That seems to me to be a confirmation.
Yes, it seems to be a confirmation. But then in 2017, I made another attempt, and I wanted to find out more. And I'll come back to that NLFZ, to that situation room later on. I just want you to know that in 2017 we had federal elections in Germany, and the federal elections time is a good time to ask questions concerning all kinds of stuff. To potential candidates of the political parties. So I asked candidates from all the political parties in Germany whether they would make German secret UFO files public. And most of them answered something like, well, I don't know of any such secret files on UFOs that could be made public, or 2 or 3 other people said, well, I can only refer to what the spokesperson of the government already told you back in 2015. So they really did their research and found my name and found this. And the left party, by the way, the Democratic Socialist Party, they took it most seriously and suggested I file FOIA requests for very specific cases and come back to them. And the Green Party, do you have a Green Party in the United States?
In theory, yes, we do. Yeah.
Okay.
We had Jill Stein was the U.S. presidential candidate for the Green Party in the last election. Yeah.
Yeah. Does it still exist?
Yes. No, they exist. They're out there.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so the Green Party is an important party in Germany. It's not in the government, but it used to be. And they had a real ridiculous answer. They said, well, transparency is of utmost importance to us. UFO files must be made public. Unfortunately, however, they are written in Klingon language and are heavily redacted. If you speak that language or know anybody who does, please contact the BND. So you see, they're making fun of me, asking for secret UFO
You
files,
get
saying
this a
it's
lot
written.
from. I was surprised when the other left party in Germany actually took your request seriously, because I find in the United States, overall, I find that the American left seems to dismiss the UFO subject much more than the right, and I've tried to understand why this is so. But I've definitely noticed this. Maybe listeners will have a different opinion, but what the Green Party said, I mean, that's just insulting.
Yeah, it is. And by the way, the main opponent of Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, was Martin Schulz, the former head of the European Commission or European Parliament, I think. And Martin Schulz, he's from the Social Democratic Party. And I had the chance to ask him personally whether he would open UFO files, because there was like a survey from let's say a big news corporation in Germany that owns several newspapers, and they made a survey on the internet. What questions would you like to ask your favorite political candidate? And I put on this question, well, would you release UFO files when you become chancellor? And out of thousands of questions, this mysteriously, my question came on top of this list.
Really?
You know, it was like, I don't know if somebody had a hacking or a bot or something. I really don't know. I didn't do it myself. I have no idea how this came to be, but in fact, it was on the very first item on that list. And so I had the chance to ask him personally, and I filmed all this, and he said, and that was really like a turning point in this whole thing. He said, if these files are not published because they are classified as secret, then I cannot promise you without appropriate legal framework to publish them. But I can assure you, I would consider what are the conditions, why are they classified as secret, and if no further secrecy is required in this area, then I would suggest to the German Bundestag that they be published.
That's a very reasonable answer.
And that's the main opponent of Angela Merkel. And the thing is, well, as you know, as Americans, you would say, well, you know, no surprise at all, you know, UFOs and elections, and you have Hillary Clinton and the Jimmy Kimmel show, and it's just normal to do that. But for German circumstances, this is just not normal at all, you know. And I can tell you that most of the journalists in the room, they were really surprised about this kind of answer. And also the local newspaper from my city, they came to me and they wanted to write an article on this, and I thought they would finally start to report seriously on this question of why Germany doesn't have files. And what they did was, in fact, they took a photo of me with a government document that I held up, and they said, it was basically an article about that weird guy who asked that strange question to our main opponent of Martin Schulz. You know, it was not nothing. I mean, anyway,
it was somewhat dismissive. It sounds like not really taking you seriously. And when did this whole exchange take place, Robert?
That was in August 2017.
Not long ago. A year ago. 1 year ago.
Yes, a year ago. Yeah, a year ago. So, what's interesting, I had also asked Angela Merkel via different media. You know, there's a website where you can ask her. I contacted her office directly and stuff. And then shortly after Martin Schulz had answered that he would open UFO files, I received her reply from the Chancellor's office, and they said, and that now she brought in another military authority in Germany that was known to me, but that didn't play any role at all in the UFO subject until then. She said, the Space Operations Center of the German military is tasked with monitoring all near-Earth objects, and since its beginnings, there has not been any data collection related to unknown flying objects, and therefore there's no material to be published. So that was a complete backlash. You know, the Space Operations Center is at the same location as the NLFZ. And then I started to make more FOIA requests and to ask them to try to find out more. Okay, so if it's not the Space Operations Center, maybe it's this Situation and Control Room, the NLFZ.
Yes.
And since I knew that the German Freedom of Information Act would not be applicable to questions of defense and national security, but only to administrative things, you know, I said, well, it's become known to me that such occurrences are being forwarded to you. I'd like to know more about the administrative procedures that are set up in place, just in case such a report comes in. And I really expected them to give me, well, this doesn't, you're not supposed to know, or something, or whatever. But they said, well, there's thank you for your inquiry. We don't deal with UFOs. And that's really weird, because what I haven't told you before is that, in fact, when this whole thing became public in December 2011, that those kinds of reports are forwarded to that Situation and Command Center.
Yes.
The NLFZ.
Yes.
I was in touch with a journalist, colleague of mine, who works for a very, very big newspaper in Germany. I can't reveal its name because it would get him into trouble. And he told me, and I believe him that it's true. He said he called the press office of the German Ministry of Defense, and he had the press officer of the Ministry of Defense confirming him on the telephone that they do receive UFO reports, and that they allegedly throw them into the bin as soon as they receive them, which is just ridiculous.
Right. Hold that thought, Robert. We're at the top of the hour. I want to return to this point. It's very important. I'm Richard Dolan here. You're listening to German journalist and UFO, shall we say, researcher. I know you don't want to be called a ufologist, but you are a UFO researcher, Robert Fleischer. And we will be back with more information on German and European UFOs after this. You're listening to KGRA Radio. We'll be right back. We're back. I'm with Robert Fleischer. Robert, we were just talking about Angela Merkel's office of the space office in Germany, I guess is how I would describe it. And you commented that they don't investigate UFOs. Could you just follow up on that?
Yes. So I was told by a colleague of mine who works for a very big news organization in Germany, that he was told by the press officer of the German Ministry of Defense that the NLFZ, so that's the Situation and Control Room for Airspace Security in Germany, that they do receive UFO reports, but when they receive them, they immediately destroy those reports and don't even look at it, which is, in my opinion, just not credible, because it's just not believable, because this is a center that is there to investigate possible threats to airspace security. And if they receive a report on some intrusion into the German airspace,
that's what they're supposed to be looking for, like unknown objects that don't make sense.
Why would
that's
they
not
destroy
what
it? Yeah, why would they destroy it? So Angela Merkel, when I asked her, she had her office respond, and her office told me that the space, she didn't speak about the NLFZ, this Situation and Control Room for Airspace Security, but she brought into play the so-called Space Operations Center, which is also part of the air operations of the German Air Force.
Okay.
And she said this Operations Center is tasked with monitoring near-Earth objects, and since its beginnings, there has not been any data collection related to unknown flying objects, and therefore there's no material to be published. So that seemed like a complete backlash, and then I still kept digging, and I kept filing FOIA reports, and I filed an FOIA report, and I wanted to know what are the administrative procedures whenever such a report comes in, and they said the Space Operations Center, or the German Air Force, they said there's no such thing here. We have nothing on file. There's nothing. But what's interesting is I didn't only file an FOIA request, but I also made an inquiry, like an official press inquiry, to the press office of the Space Operations Center.
Oh, interesting.
And that was, and I received a completely different information, and they said. They answered, if unexplained phenomena occur in airspace or near Earth space or on request of other authorities, the Space Operations Center checks whether there is a re-entry of space debris, rocket stages, or similar, or an entry of asteroids, meteorites into the observed area that could possibly be the cause of the above-mentioned phenomena. So at least they are not mentioning unexplained. I mean, they are mentioning unexplained phenomena,
Yes.
and they are saying, yes, we do investigate it, and we look whether it's an asteroid or meteoroid or something,
So they are
And
saying that there are procedures. There are
yes,
procedures in place for this.
they are saying absolutely.
Yes.
They are saying we do investigate this. So it is really interesting. It was really interesting that an official FOIA request would get like a void answer, whereas a press inquiry would gain much more information from that. But still, I don't know anything. I made an appeal to that answer they gave me, but still no results.
Well, they're
So
stonewalling you, I mean, to such a ridiculous extent, but there's obviously not a 100% coordination among all of the different parts of the German government, because it's a large government. And so
yes,
you found a little
and
wedge to open up there.
and what's interesting, this has always been the question: is there any office at all, any authority at all that deals with UFO subjects? And I came to know a retired general from the German Ministry of Defense. He's actually a doctor in the rank of a general. He worked for decades in the highest ranks of the ministry, and also at SHAPE headquarters.
That's strategic headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Forces.
Of NATO.
Yeah, NATO. Yeah, very important.
NATO. And very important person, and he was in the audience of one of my presentations when I talked about all this, and then afterwards he came to me and he said, "Look, there's something that you may want to know," and he started to talk about his own experiences. First of all, he had his own UFO sighting, which I will go into afterwards.
Oh, yes.
But in terms of the German authorities, he said it may very well be the case that in fact no German authority is concerned with UFOs, and that may appear bizarre because of all the other countries, as you have pointed out in your presentation, Robert, as all the other countries have been dealing with it. And why is it that Germany is not dealing with it? And he explained to me that it has to do with Germany's special role as after the World War II, actually. It has to do with Germany not being a sovereign state until 1990. The air supremacy was divided among the Allied powers. And this retired general says that this has led German authorities to become some sort of resignated and afraid to take responsibility over their own matters. And over the years, this has become sort of institutionalized in the administrative processes. And whenever there was something bizarre, he says, the Germans were actually happy to leave it to the Allied powers, mainly the United States, the UK, and France, but there were also the Danish and the Belgians who had small portions of this air supremacy. So whatever happened in the German airspace until 1990, the German authorities didn't have any control about this. That's
so it
interesting
seems like,
to know.
oh, it's fascinating. So it seems like it could be a NATO administrative problem, not a German. At least the matter of German UFOs might perhaps fall under NATO's domain rather than the German government's domain. What do you think about that?
Well, now that's a good question, because first of all, the question is if Germany has ever become a sovereign national state after 1990.
Well, what is the nature of sovereignty in today's world? I mean, my goodness,
Yes.
you have the EU, we've got all kinds of all methods of globalization and international legal arrangements that really take national sovereignty deeply into question, and not simply with Germany, by the way, of course, but with really every nation in the world. There are very few nations that I think that are truly sovereign anymore. Yeah,
and he said that actually, if you think about it, after 1990, the air supremacy or the control over the German airspace was officially handed over to the Germans again. But unofficially, of course, the Americans especially, they play a huge role.
Oh,
What they are
yes.
doing on their Ramstein base. No one knows what they.
That
I
is
mean,
right.
this is a huge area. They have flights coming in and out. I don't know if the Germans are aware of anything, of
Hmm.
everything, every single plane that's going in and out and stuff. And also, there is evidence to suggest that the Germans left UFO sightings to the U.S. military before 1990, and it may very well be the case that this is still so now after 1990. There's one case, I can't remember the exact year, but there was one case where a Cessna pilot called Mayday over the radio because there was a UFO that circled around his plane, and his airplane started to rotate around its own axis. So he started to call Mayday, Mayday. And after his landing, he landed in Hanover, and then he was not interrogated by German authorities, but by U.S. military intelligence officers on German soil.
What
And he
was
was
the
even
year of this? Do you recall the year?
yeah, I don't know right now. I don't
Okay.
know right
Okay.
now.
Okay.
80s, 90s, something like this.
Okay.
And he was eventually even sworn to secrecy. Like he was told never to talk about this incident to anybody. By like a German, just imagine, German private pilot is, has a UFO incident. He lands.
And here come
He's
the
interrogated
Americans.
by U.S. military intelligence officers who order him not to talk about this. What
Yeah.
is that? I mean, how is that even possible? So that incident already points to the possibility that the Americans have been dealing with UFO incidents in Germany, just as they have been dealing with UFO incidents in all other parts of the
Well,
world,
yes,
like
and
Brazil.
I don't want to
Just
take.
think of
Yeah, go on. I'm sorry. Go on.
yeah, just think of the island of Colares Operation Saucer thing, where with the thing that was officially ended by the Brazilian Ministry of Defense or Brazilian military, and then the Americans continued that operation under another name and in secret.
Yeah.
And think about the Iran case, Parvez Jafari, who in 1976, I think. Was scrambled with his jet to chase a UFO, and
Yes.
then turned out to be chased himself by the UFO. So and there were the Americans all meddled in all this kinds of stuff.
Well,
So it
this is. I
looks
don't want to take this away from the German UFO scene,
yeah.
but I'll just add here. I'll interject that what the U.S. did with that German private pilot. This is indeed what the United States does with really every other nation on the world, other than the Russians and Chinese and the few nations that are really outside of the U.S. reach. All of South America. Anytime there's a South American UFO situation, if it's important enough, the United States is on top of it and they dominate it. This also goes with Europe, and that is because the United States national security intelligence community has their tentacles, their hooks into all of those nations and really dominates them all. The United States does not allow true sovereignty to really any other nation, at least in terms of its foreign relations, and it appears in terms of UFO policy. The other nations will have different levels of independence. So, for example, the United Kingdom, Britain, will have more leeway, clearly, than, say, than Poland will these days under U.S. control, or more than Chile will, or other nations. But they all have different levels of what they're allowed to do. But in terms of the UFO situation, I have strongly felt for years that the United States dominates and really coordinates closely with the intelligence agencies of all the other nations that is able to.
BND, the German BND, is actually an American outlet. That
Yeah.
it used to be the German branch of the Central Intelligence Agency, if
Yes.
you will.
Yeah. Exactly.
That's how
exactly.
it was founded. Anyway, so this is some kind of clue that hints to the possibility that after 1990, when Germany regained its official sovereignty over its own airspace, that this situation that had lasted for decades just had left a void. And that no ministry would be willing to jump in. on the responsibility. And I talked to that general, and he told me, well, if just imagine, a ministry, if you receive some UFO inquiry, would you even touch it? Because there's this regulation. If you start to touch it, then you will have to touch it again. So you will be responsible for it. And there's also, I mean, no ministry would ever touch the subject. So if any authority would be concerned with the subject, then it would be because of the German chancellor to direct or to order that ministry to take charge of that subject. So he said, may very well be that, and that's the general who worked in the German Ministry of Defense for quite some time. He said, may very well be that Germany is just the exception on the international level, because there's no ministry or any authority that deals with UFOs. However, I must add that I know that the German MUFON Association, there's a German branch, or a German, let's call it cousin of American MUFON CES, Central European section.
Yes.
They actually have a good connection with the military, and whenever they receive a report on UFOs, they file an FOIA request, and they have a contact there, and that contact, they sends them even radar plots and analysis and stuff. So they are very open. He says, we can't complain at all about the military hiding stuff from us. It's the complete opposite. Now that's interesting, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Not every nation does this the same way. So
I told you this general, we talked about this, and then he went on to say, and by the way, I also had my own sighting. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, it was a long time ago in December of 1982. He was working as a medical doctor at that time in his military capacity. And he was called on a rescue mission to save an old man who had suffered a cardiac arrest. In that specific region, that's in Lower Saxony, I believe. At that time, there were no medical emergency helicopters available.
Okay.
Civil medical emergency helicopters. So they had some kind of agreement with the police that whenever something would happen, they were allowed to call the military in. And so they were called to assist with their search and rescue helicopter. And they flew there. It took him quite some time to resuscitate that old man, and they flew him to a hospital in Celle. That's the name of that city. And when they arrived there, the old man on the bench, he had another cardiac arrest, and the medics, he said, they started running down the hallway with him, and I was completely exhausted. And a nurse saw the former general that he was so exhausted, and offered him a coffee and his helicopter crew before they went on to return to their base in Fassberg, at the Fassberg base where they were stationed in Lower Saxony. And then between midnight and 1 a.m. on December 6th, they jumped into their helicopter again and flew back to their base. And the weather was very bad that night. There were low clouds, drizzling rain. Their helicopter was flying at a low altitude, around 50 meters above above ground surface, around 20 meters above the treetops.
Very low
yes,
indeed, yes.
Very low. I don't know why that was, maybe because of the wind, or I don't know. And then suddenly, he says, he noticed on his left-hand side some glowing clouds, lights in the clouds, and he was wondering, why is it glowing in the clouds? And he said it was a very bright light. It was comparable to that of a spotlight in intensity, but it had a quite different quality. He describes it as a very bright green, whitish light, which didn't hurt the eye. When you looked at it. It was continuously flowing, he said. It looked like water from a spring. It was nice to look at. It flew alongside them. The distance, he said, was difficult to ascertain. He said he estimated it around 100-meter distance, but it was really difficult because it was night. There was no reference points to the eye.
Was this a light in the clouds only, or did it
No,
did it
that
leave
was
the
not.
clouds?
No. It was initially in the cloud, and then it came out of the cloud, and it
Okay.
was a light ball,
I
a
see.
greenish, whitish light ball
Okay.
that very bright with very different quality of light that he had ever seen before. That's what
Okay.
he insisted on, that it was a very strange light, something he had never seen before. And they were flying like 160 kilometers per hour. So how much is that? Like 80 miles or something?
About almost 100 miles per hour,
Yeah.
maybe 90 something miles per hour.
And the pilot said to the onboard mechanic guy, "Who's flying there at this weather?" And there were four guys on the helicopter, and they were wondering if this was some kind of secret aircraft. And they decided to call the tower, the air control tower of the nearby airfield Langenhagen, to check whether they had any air traffic nearby. But the controller answered they only had their helicopter on their screen and nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
And that strange light accompanied the helicopter for about 1 or 2 minutes. And then suddenly the light makes a sharp right angle turn towards the helicopter, and it shoots at them at a great speed. And they are all shocked in the helicopter. The pilot tore the helicopter sharply down right, and when the light had
Wow.
approached the helicopter, at 10 meters or so, the general heard a static radio noise on his headset, and the onboard mechanic screamed to the pilot, "Watch out, you're getting into the trees." And then the object changed its direction very rapidly and
Yes.
shot upwards in the air, where it disappeared in another glowing cloud. And fortunately, the helicopter came to rest above a small lake in the forest that just happened to be there, where the pilot managed to stabilize it. And that saved their lives,
That's
because otherwise it
fascinating.
would have crashed into the tree. So this UFO sighting actually almost caused the death of 4 soldiers, right?
This is
They,
this is very similar. I want to hear the rest of it, but just people should know this is reminds me. There's a famous American case from about a decade earlier, from the fall of 1973, involving a U.S. pilot named Lawrence Coyne, Coyne, and he was a U.S. military helicopter pilot, had a very dramatic encounter with a glowing UFO that approached his helicopter, and they did all kinds of altitude changes as well. It was quite dramatic, and they nearly had some major equipment malfunctions as well. And this is a German case now from, you said, December 1982?
yes, December 6th, 1982.
Nearly
Yeah.
resulting in their death. So go on. This is fascinating.
And so they kept hovering over that little lake in the forest for a couple of minutes. First of all, to come clean with what they just experienced, and then also to see whether the light would return. And they also contacted the airfield Langenhagen again to verify if there really was no other traffic in the area. But the controller there insisted that the helicopter there was the only radar return in the area. And he added, "But we just saw you flying a strange maneuver. What was that?" But they didn't answer.
Wow.
And after a while, they continued their flight back to Fassberg base, and the weather was so bad they had to open the door for landing. So it was really bad weather at that time. And this general, he's still, after so many years, he's still so impressed by what he's seen. He said to me, this light, it demonstrated such an incredible maneuverability, way beyond anything I've seen before. Mass inertia law didn't seem to apply to it, because it made this sharp angle turn towards them and then shot off at a great rate of speed, just up in the sky, like no mass inertia. It's really weird. And he said there were no, he said, I'm not sure if this was a solid object at all. And there were no physical interferences with the helicopter, like instruments going crazy or anything, besides of the static on the radio. But after the landing, the 4 men talked about the incident, and they decided they would not report it for fear of losing their good reputations and flight license.
Wow, yes.
And he kept this incident for himself for many decades, until around 2012 or so. He read the French Kcra report,
Yes.
which is UFOs and the defense, what do we have to prepare for, or something. That's the title. It's
Yes,
interesting.
Yeah.
And therein he found sightings reports from other pilots who had seen similar light balls, and that really shook him, and it really got him to the point where he said, okay, now I have to go and report this, so at least the sighting will be recorded somewhere. And so he went public with his sighting, but anonymously. He just provided the data to a certain UFO organization, and he talked to me personally. But of course, I cannot reveal his identity, which
No,
is a
understood.
pity. Of course, I told him, this is exactly the case of the type of cases that we would need, like military encounters of the German military, to convince other witnesses to come forward with their own reports, so that this whole subject gains the credibility it actually has. But because people are fearing ridicule and stuff,
Oh, yes.
and disadvantages for their career, they just won't go public. So there are those close encounters in the German military as well, but of course not no faces, no names. That's a
The
pity.
cases are there. That's a fascinating case, Robert. Thank you
It
for
is.
describing it. If you're on good enough terms with this general, perhaps he might agree to writing you a private little affidavit where he can sign. And I don't know how old he is, but perhaps after his death, he might give you permission to publicize it. But that's a whole other issue. I don't know if he'll allow
I hope
that.
he still has many healthy years ahead.
So do I. I'm just trying to think of all the possibilities here, because he clearly doesn't want the information out while he's alive. So,
Yeah.
But anyway, that's a fascinating story, and it's also December 1982. I think you said this was during the 4 years that the German intelligence was monitoring UFOs over the inner German border. Now, Saxony,
Yes.
I think, is not quite at that border.
Well, it is actually. It is.
Ah.
It is not so far from the inner German. It's not so far at all. They were inside this the no-fly zone for German aircraft with their base.
This would conceivably be something that maybe they would have recorded.
No, but it was never recorded because
Yeah.
they never filed an official report on their on their sighting, because they were fearing, they were afraid of ridicule and disadvantages for their career, and also for the flight license. He said at that time, it's a lot about the standing that you have as a pilot, and then if people come and say, oh, this is the guy who's had this weird sighting, well, we'll better not choose him for that specific mission.
This is the same with pilots around the world.
And this was, I guess this was before he went on to become a general, to have the rank of a general. So
Sure.
I assume he would have never become a general if he had told this, to anybody.
Good point. Well, Robert, we're at the bottom of the hour. Do you realize we've gone through 3 fascinating segments, and we still want to talk about a couple of very interesting recent UFO incidents in Germany, and also you were investigating the French drone UFO situation of 2014, and I think people would really like to hear about that. So how about when we come back after the break, we discuss the Bremen Airport incident. I think you said that's in 2010.
Yes.
And
2014.
2014. My mistake. Mm-hmm. And then the French situation as well, because you actually done some detailed investigation of that. So I'm Richard Dolan here. This is Kcra Radio. We're listening to German journalist Robert Fleischer. And Robert's websites, incidentally, he's got 2 of them. One is exomagazine.tv. That's Exo Magazine without the E, if you're an English speaker, .tv. And exopolitic with a K.org. Is that correct, Robert?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. And Robert is the founder of Exopolitics Germany. He is the founder of Exo Magazine TV as well. These are both very active, and I encourage you to go check out his websites where you can learn more about what's going on.
If you speak German, of course.
If you speak German. Well, if you've got a good translator on your website, you might be able to hack your way through it, as I do sometimes with foreign language websites. It's the best that I can do. Google has their little translating thing on their browser, so I actually make a lot of use of that when I can. It's not perfect, but what can you do?
There's a better one. It's called deepl.com. It's a German company. DeepL, like deep learning. deepl.com. Go and use that one. It's so much better than Google Translator.
Oh, that's great to know. deepl.com. Thank you, Robert.
Yeah.
Well, I'll make a note of it, and I hope our listeners do as well. But anyway, we'll be back right after this. on KGRA Radio. Stick around. We're back. I'm Richard Dolan here with German journalist Robert Fleischer. Robert, there have been a few UFO incidents in recent years that you have investigated in Germany and in France. Can we start by talking about the incident at the Bremen airport in 2014? If you would describe where Bremen is and what exactly happened.
Yes, Bremen is right in the top northern corner of Germany, next to the Danish border, in fact, and that's a relatively small airport. And on January 2, 2014, at around 6 a.m. Oh no, it was 6 p.m. The air traffic controller in the control tower of Bremen Airport, he noticed a strange signal on his primary radar, and it indicated an object around 3 nautical miles, that's 5.5 kilometers south of the runway. And the air traffic controller then sees the object visually from the tower without binoculars. And it seems to have normal red and green position lights, he says, and a landing light on each side. But since the object is located near the approach zone of the airport, the Lufthansa, a Lufthansa aircraft coming from Munich, is asked to abort the landing procedure and then to restart. And the pilot told us that we are on a collision course with a helicopter that flies unlit and below the radar, recalls one of the passengers on board of that flight in an interview with a German newspaper. And then what's interesting, this plane has to take off twice. The air traffic control decides to reroute it to another airport, and for safety reasons, the air traffic will be completely suspended for 15 minutes. The air traffic controller in the control room observes the object for several minutes as it moves 3.5 nautical miles south of the Weser River from the final approach area of the airport and apparently along the railway road to the Weser. Okay, the thing is, then he loses it out of sight. He loses sight contact to the object. That's according to the press officer of the air traffic control in Bremen. The object at 6:30 p.m. returns. The air traffic controller has visual contact again, and now it's located above a hospital. And the air traffic controller notifies the police, and police immediately alerts patrol cars that are in the area. Around that time, police officers see a strange flying object in the area of the cathedral of the Weser Stadium. They describe it as very bright, about the size of a helicopter. They estimate the altitude of about 300 to 400 meters, and the officers assume that the object is about to return to the airport and notify air traffic control, and they cancel the planned takeoff of another airplane scheduled for 5 minutes to 7 p.m. The Bremen police also asks a helicopter squadron from Lower Saxony to search for the unidentified flying object. And now it gets interesting. This a police patrol car gets visual contact to the unknown flying object in the area of Lake Werdersee, and the police helicopter from Lower Saxony is on site at 7:30 p.m. and supports the Bremen officials in their search for the flying object, but they find nothing. However, the pilot of the police helicopter later explains to a newspaper, "We saw something, but we're not sure what it was." The helicopter was very well equipped with night vision goggles and thermal imaging equipment, but yes, they say there was a lot of light above the city center and we had no height information. A couple of minutes later, like 9 minutes to 9 p.m., the police helicopter reports the sighting of an unlit flying object to the air traffic control. An unlit flying object, without lights.
Unlit, yes.
Yeah, the air traffic controllers then instruct another aircraft coming in from Paris that's already on its final approach to the airport to abort the landing and take off. And that plane will later land safely in Bremen. And then, 5 minutes to 9 p.m., the police helicopter stops its search for the unidentified flying objects, and the distance that this object has traveled in the meantime has later been calculated. And in summary, it flew quite a bit in the air. It was sometimes enlightened, sometimes not. There wasn't always visual contact, and also the appearance described by several witnesses is quite different. It's not navigation lights in every single case, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So this was really difficult a difficult sighting for the airspace security at the airport. And in the middle of the night on January 7, the German UFO database, that's a website, ufo-datenbank.de. They have a website where you can report UFO incidents, and they receive a sightings report directly from an employee of the Bremen airport. They don't, nobody knows who he is, but he says more than 10 witnesses observed a UFO between 6:30 and 9:30 p.m., unknown flying object on the radar, temporary closure of airspace, flights had to be rerouted, helicopter searched the sky above Bremen. No one knows who that person is who filed that report.
Okay.
But it's really an interesting case because there were so many contradictions afterwards. You wouldn't know, was it a real radar contact or not? In the first press release, a reputed news agency, German press agency, DPA, mm-hmm. They said that it appeared on the radar screen, and later on they withdrew that statement and said no, it didn't. And so it was really not clear whether it appeared there or not. And the chief press officer of the German air traffic control said, well, it was only visible within 2 radar rounds. So in that
so they did
regard,
get it. They did get it on radar, but then
they did get something on
yes.
the radar, but they wouldn't speak of it as a radar contact. That's how they said it. The object as such was not located on the radar according to our standards. But they saw it visually.
But they got something
above the,
and they did see
above
it
the airport.
And you said it was described as the size roughly of a helicopter. So I would think that would rule out, excuse me, like commercial drones
yes.
That ordinary
yes.
people would have. So this is really quite large.
Yes, and that's also interesting how the German press reacted after this incident, because now suddenly you have a serious UFO encounter in above a German airport.
Yes,
UFO in the real meaning of the term, unidentified flying object. And they suddenly it's so severe that they even have to interrupt air traffic for a couple of minutes. They have to reroute planes to other.
Well, and in fact cause danger to at least one aircraft.
Yes.
So
they had to abort their landing procedure during this. So what's interesting? So suddenly the German media is suddenly confronted with a UFO case that's stuff that you usually only hear from China or whatever, and right. You suddenly have it at your doorstep, and mm-hmm. Now it was really interesting to watch how they would react. And the first reaction was that, well, at that time there was a skeptic from a UFO researcher known to be a skeptic, but skeptic, who had a good connections to the media, and he said, well, this was most certainly only what we call a radar angel, which is like some sort of erroneous radar return that reflects from a house or a tree or something, and sometimes that shows up, and that's what we call radar angel. That must have been that. Even though they said they saw it visually, but yes, still, the German media, they didn't care. They reported, okay, case closed. It was only erroneous radar signal. Then the spokesperson of the German air traffic control said, no, it was also seen visually, and also we later found out the helicopter crew, they saw an object that was unlit an unlit object that they discovered, but they couldn't find out what it was. They just saw it for a short term. And I asked the police spokesman, how exactly did the helicopter crew describe the object? Since they say this unlit object forced the air traffic control to stop the landing of an incoming craft, so it must have been something, right?
Exactly.
And he said, we are not commenting on this. This is the subject of ongoing criminal proceedings. So it's interesting. There's something, but they don't say what it is. Later on, a couple of days later, on January 21st, the Bremen police and the public prosecutor present their findings about the UFO at the Bremen airport. And their actual investigation results are just nothing. They're more focused on what it was not. They say they evaluated more than 50 tips and various witness interviews, and the police assesses the situation as follows. Some citizens may have observed and described the police helicopter used. That is true. Some citizens did.
Yes.
But they say it must have been a drone. They say the still unknown operator of the unidentified flying object is likely to come from the model aircraft or multicopter scene. The device was probably steered by a professional hobby model airplane. The device was probably a professionally hobby model airplane that was steered from a computer at the desk or from the open countryside, which is technically feasible under certain circumstances. But was it really so? Because we remember the police is unaware. They saw something, an unlit object. They stopped air traffic for quite some time, and they didn't. They said, we suspect the unknown operator to come from the multicopter scene, from the model aircraft or multicopter scene.
Yes.
But for the German media, case is closed again. Suddenly you have news reports popping up saying, case closed, it was a drone. We are sure, police says, we are sure it was a drone.
This is the new explanation wherever you go. And we're going to get to the French cases in a moment where it's the same thing. They describe these things as drones. But yeah, it seems like there's much more going on with this Bremen case, and maybe it is a drone. I mean, I suppose it's possible.
Maybe.
But it would be a very large and high-performance drone, it would seem to me.
Yeah, well, and the flight characteristics described, didn't really resemble what we usually call a real UFO sighting with erroneous.
Has anyone wondered if this could be a U.S. military type of operation? I'm trying to think what the U.S. may have up in the northern part of Germany there, and I actually don't recall what bases or what operations might have been responsible for this. Did anyone look into that?
I think most of the U.S. bases are more in the center of, south of Germany, Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg and stuff. I mean, we can make all kinds of assumptions of what this object was. It may very well be it was a drone. The fact is just that, the police said we suspect it was a drone. And then on March 24, the police closes its investigation without any results. They have no clue what it was, but for the German for the German public, it's clear that it was a drone. And, that made me think that, even back then in January 2014, when I looked into this case, and I talked to the German air traffic control and all this, I thought, okay, what if this is like the new way how they would sell authentic, real UFO sightings to the public as just being some drone interferences, and I just thought this because
exactly.
just imagine, I even back then I thought, just imagine what would happen if a UFO shows up in a very sensitive airspace, and you couldn't tell this to the general public, right? That there was something you have no control of that just pops up in the airspace, and you don't know what it is, and then it suddenly disappears, and you still have no idea what it is. That was in January 2014, and then in October 2014. Something extraordinary happened started happening in France. You ever heard of this I called it the drone plague.
I remember this. It made the news, even over here in the U.S. For a time, and it was a wave of unusual UFO sightings. I believe they occurred, if I'm not mistaken, near nuclear facilities or other
Yes,
sensitive facilities in France. And am I right in thinking they were all described as
dozens.
drones? Drones.
Let's. I mean, what you need to understand is France is unlike any other country in Europe, so dependent on nuclear energy. They have,
Mm.
let's say, they've given all their nuclear or all their energy. Uh, their energy production scheme is mainly nuclear energies, like 90% of the, I don't know, I mean, it's like mainly powered by nuclear energy, you know.
Yeah.
So they have lots of nuclear power plants, and all those nuclear power plants, they're all operated by a national organization called Électricité de France, Electricity of France, EDF, and they oversee the correct functioning and security and stuff, and they operate those nuclear bases. And in October 2014, the media started reporting on an apparent wave of drone sightings over French nuclear power plants.
Yeah.
Even on the German media, it was even on large German media organizations reported that as of October, on October 13, there was a drone. They always said drone sighted above the Blayais nuclear power plant near Bordeaux and above the Nogent-sur-Seine nuclear power plant. On October 14, that's one day later, above the Cattenom power station near the German border. On October 19, above the nuclear sites of Chooz, Gravelines, Le Bugey, and again above Nogent-sur-Seine, and one day later again above Le Bugey.
May I
And
ask you, before we go any
yes,
further, are these drone UFO sightings, are they scattered throughout France, or are
that's
they
the
in a
point.
particular
That
region of France?
that's the point. The fact that on Sunday, October 19 alone, 4 nuclear power plants were affected, which are very far apart. You know, it makes
Ah,
safety
okay.
experts think, well, what is it? Is this a large-scale action? You know, they start
Yes.
to suspect, what are those? Is this Greenpeace? You know, French
Yeah.
mass media quickly identified the suspect Greenpeace, because Greenpeace likes to fly over nuclear power plants with a drone to show that they are vulnerable to possible air attacks. And just recently, they crashed a drone. By the way, just a couple of weeks ago, they crashed a drone into a French power plant to demonstrate that it's
Intentionally.
vulnerable
Wow, Greenpeace. Okay.
intentionally,
Yeah.
intentionally. And so they said it must be Greenpeace.
Mm-hmm.
But an activist of the Environmental Protection
Mm-hmm.
Organization, you know, they had already drawn attention to safety deficiencies back in 2012. So, and they also denied that they had anything to do with the overflights. They said we have nothing to do with it.
Greenpeace
And
denied this? Greenpeace?
Greenpeace
Yeah.
denied they had exactly.
Yeah.
Greenpeace
Okay.
denied they had anything to do with this, and they said, and we are very concerned about the repeated overflights over the nuclear power plants, and this
Okay.
whole thing continues. It's not just in October. It continues all through November, December. You have when this whole thing becomes public in October, mid-October, you have a whole frenzy, lots of activity going on at the side of the politicians in France. You have the French Interior Minister Bernard Cazeneuve, who announces on October 30th that they have put in place devices to neutralize drones, and investigations are already underway. Um, However, they don't detail how this neutralization should take place, because it's not even clear yet who is responsible for the overflights and what exactly flew around there.
Right.
And then 2 more power plants are overflown by supposed drones who are very far apart. And then it goes on and on and on, and it's like almost all of the French nuclear power plants are overflown by so-called drones. And actually, I didn't only look at the news reports in the French local media and national newspapers, but I also had a look at of course, at the original press release by Électricité de France. And what it always said in there, because I was wondering, they described drones. They said they were small in size and commercially available. However, some people who saw the drones, they said they were actually big. They had a huge spotlight that lit up the whole zone, the whole thing. One drone was supposed to was allegedly flying above a nuclear power plant in weather conditions that are completely opposite to what a drone is capable to do.
I've heard this as well. Some of those details did seep out into the English speaking news media. Because I distinctly recall that there were a couple of eyewitnesses, at least allegedly, that were saying, as you're describing here, that these objects were pretty large and were
some of them, not only,
and were able to fly under very difficult conditions.
Mm. And there was one night when 5 nuclear power plants were overflown by supposed drones, which were if you look at the map, scattered all over France, at the very same time. So this must have been a coordinated effort by someone. But I looked at the original press release, and in the original press release from Électricité de France, they don't say it was a drone. They call it an aéronef assimilable à un drone. So that means an aircraft similar to a drone. They don't say it was a drone. They say it was something that seemed to be like a drone. Mm-hmm. And then this whole thing goes on and on and on. And we talk to experts in drones and multicopters. And I have a friend who is actually the boss of a company that does commercial drone flights with cameras on board for television and stuff, and he explained to me that, well, if you just look at the one example with this huge spotlight that was on board, how would that even be possible on a drone? Exactly. That is, they have small batteries that cannot be too heavy, because then the flight capacity would be very limited, and then even if they would have to power as an additional spotlight that sets so much light that the whole area is illuminated, it seems very unlikely that this was a drone. And then at some time in January 22nd, a director of a nuclear power plant, he was the head of the Blayais nuclear power plant in southwestern France. He presented the results for 2014 and plans for the new year, and there was a press conference, and he was asked about drones and if there was anything new about the drone that had flown over his nuclear reactor in October 2014.
Yes.
And then he said, surprisingly, we haven't seen a drone here, we have seen a UFO, and there has been no effect on the safety of our installations. And So he really says it was not a drone; it was a UFO.
What was his
and this
position?
whole thing.
Who was this man?
His name is Pascal Pessani.
And what was his position?
He was the head of the Blayais nuclear power plant in southwestern France.
Okay, I thought so. So he's one of the heads of a nuclear power plant, stating UFO.
He says it's not a drone. It was a UFO, and we have seen a UFO. That's what he says. Ce qu'on a vu, c'était un ovni. Il n'y avait aucun effet sur la sécurité des installations. And if you think about it, it's more or less logical to assume that if the national operator of all the nuclear power plants, like one very strategic, important pilier of France, what would be the public reaction in France if the operator of those nuclear power plants would freely admit that they are being overflown by strange objects they don't know where they come from? And exactly. What would be the reaction? So you see, this drone explanation, it actually came in quite handy to them to say, well, it looked like a drone, so they already kind of suggested it was a drone. so that people wouldn't start to ask complicated questions,
No,
and I think
you
this
can imagine this is very politically sensitive in France.
It is in a country like France that is so dependent on nuclear power, especially. And then this whole thing culminated, by the way, in January of 2015 when drones overflew a military base in Bretagne, which is where the atomic submarines of the French Navy are stationed, and they have 380 atomic bombs there. And this ultra-sensitive place, you don't just fly in with a hobby drone, and if you do, then you'll only do it once, and then you'll end up in jail.
Right.
But this has, in fact, happened without anybody who was arrested. They didn't find who was responsible for it. Those objects, flying objects, were registered by, they called it security devices, and observed by security personnel, and they showed up in above that military no-fly zone just when one of the nuclear submarines was supposed to perform a maneuver. So this looks like some kind of observation whatever was going on there. A local newspaper described that this incident has led to an impressive military presence afterwards. Search helicopters, dozens of Marines were mobilized. They combed the area, they carried out vehicle controls, they looked for the drone pilots for several hours. They didn't find anyone. And this, just to think about it, there's unknown flying objects above the largest or the most important, one of the most important military bases, military installations in France, and no trace of who is responsible for it.
I think this is a fascinating, and this is contemporary. We're talking 2014, 2015.
Yes.
Perhaps, I don't want to put the pressure on you, but maybe you can write an article on this and put it out on the web so we can actually read a kind of a comprehensive analysis of it. I think it would be very interesting. But,
well, I wrote several articles on it on my website, exopolitics.org, because with updates and stuff, but it's all in German, and I just have no time to sit down and translate all this into English.
We'll work on this. We're going to get an English translation of this. I think other people want to read about this. But Robert, that's all we have the time for tonight. It's been an absolute enlightening experience to talk with you about German ufology and European UFOs, and all the detail that you've gone into. We're much better for hearing what you've got to say. Again, I would just remind listeners, if they want to learn more about Robert Fleischer, please go to exomagazine.tv. That's exomagazine without the E.tv, exopolitique with a K.org. And Robert,
we also have a YouTube channel with more than 50,000 subscribers.
Oh, fabulous.
Exomagazine TV.
Yeah. Exomagazine TV on YouTube. Thank you for mentioning that, and we will provide a link for that. That's all we have the time for, Robert. It's been an absolute pleasure. Robert Fleischer, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
And with that, it's time to say goodnight. Thanks for listening. If you want to hear more follow-up conversation between Robert and myself, you can go to richarddolanmembers.com, where we go further into amazing conversation about a practically forgotten but very compelling French case from 1965, the Valençol landing event, which Robert has done a great deal of follow-up investigation on. And remember, while we learn and grow and search for the truth, let's be good to each other. Good night. Thanks for listening to The Richard Dolan Show. You can join me live most Mondays at KGRA Radio, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. To learn more about what I'm up to, visit richarddolanmembers.com, where you can read my latest articles or listen to my off-the-cuff thoughts on pretty much anything. Also, don't forget richarddolanpress.com, where I publish books by myself and some of the most interesting authors of our time. Catch you later.